All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Meredith. I'm with the Department of General Services. I'm a capital outlay program manager with the state of California running a major capital outlay program. We welcome to webinar number 8 for the year. This is actually going to be our last one for this year, and we're already planning for next year. So today's agenda, go ahead, is, as you can see there on your screen now, it's very self-explanatory. No need to run through that. Next slide. I would like to introduce Mr. Eric Hissauer. Eric is a President Emeritus for the Western Pacific Region Board and is very instrumental in helping me with the Owners Council, and he is retired now, but has a new company, the New Normal Leadership and Development Group, and Eric is going to walk us through several slides here, and I will circle back and introduce our speakers for the day. So Eric, can you take it from here?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Mike. We're pretty excited about today's topic. We've been looking to get this group to present to us for a couple of years now. So the DBIA mission is to promote this design build project delivery model and teach the effective integration of design and construction. So it's not only design build as most people know it, but also looking at IPD, progressive design build. So it's an evolution of the delivery model. The DBIA vision is to be the preeminent resource for leadership education. So with that, we've been putting on these webinars, and there's a whole industry education segment to the function of DBIA. Next. Here's the information and training situation available at DBIA. We have the manual of practice. This is free to all DBIA members. This is a pretty important document, gives you a lot of great information. The designated design build professional certification is intended to recognize acceptable standard of expertise and knowledge in design build. And we're seeing more and more clients putting the DBIA designation certification requirement in their RFPs. We have online learning with the 24/7 access, and some of the educational courses include the fundamentals of project delivery, principles of design build, contracts and risk management, etc. So you can get some of these online as well. We're always looking for volunteers. We are the largest region of all the regions within DBIA, but we've got all of these different committees, and some of the most active ones are the programs committee and then naturally the golf committee. But we welcome your participation. Please submit your interest if you want to get involved in one of these committees, regardless of where you're at in the region. So the Owners Council information. We have public agency education and training workshops that are available, and that will get you to the DBIA credential workshop as well. So if you go to that website, you'll see the opportunities that are available. We have 2 owner hotlines. One is more local than the other, but in either case, you typically get a response back within 24 to 48 hours on any questions you might have relative to the delivery model. And another benefit is that you can post your project announcements there too, and that gets you in direct contact with those people who are most accustomed to using the design build delivery model. Next. So this will be our last webinar, as Mike just said, and we're hoping to kick off in either January or February next year. So we look forward to having you back with us in the new year. And then we have some save the date stuff. A couple of young professional events that are coming up. The one in Sacramento looks extremely interesting. It's a Leadership and Legends dinner that came out. Some of the training, we have BIM execution planning in Pasadena. There's a golf tournament or two listed here. And then there's some social events as well as a luncheon program coming up in the Bay Area in the middle of October. Next. Here's our board of directors. It's a very large board of directors, but when you consider that we have chapters in California, Arizona, Nevada, and Hawaii, we have representatives from all of those chapters, and we have a total of 7 or 8 chapters, I forget at the moment, but so there's a lot of people doing a lot of good things. And this is our website. We encourage you to look at it. You can see our calendar, education opportunities, networking events, and so forth. And I'll turn it back to Mike.
Okay. Eric, thanks. So I don't know if everybody can hear, but there does seem to be a little bit of background noise that went away there for a minute, and we're not really sure what that is. So apologies if you're hearing that. Any of you listeners are hearing that. So before I get into this particular slide, I did want to remind everybody that you can apply for continuing education units for this event, and you can also get a copy of this that will be posted by Irene or Gloria, that will be posted to the Western Pacific Region website probably later this afternoon. And we've got previous webinars on there as well. So it's an excellent reference if you do happen to miss the live version. Okay, now Design Build 101. This is a slide that just reminds everybody that we try to come up with an annual theme and then try to make all of our presentations relevant to owners in particular, with a foundation in certain concepts. And this year, of course, it's concepts of design, build, done right. And then, of course, that's closely tied to DBIA's Manual of Practice. So we obviously are always going to continually will strive to provide this enrichment and education to owners, always with the DBIA best practices in mind. Next slide. All right, so obviously this is a recap at this point. At one point in time, we may have messaged that we were going to do an October 23rd webinar, but as Eric mentioned, for a variety of reasons, we've decided to stop with this particular presentation. And so this is the opportunity here where I encourage all of the listeners to, based on what you see here in your screen or based on what we provided in last year's 8 or 9 presentations, if there's something that you haven't heard yet that you'd like to hear, please contact us. You can do that through addresses on the Western Pacific Region website. There's an owners portal. In fact, there's a national owners portal now as well. And it will happily consider whatever might be an interest to you. Okay, so before I introduce our very distinguished speakers, I also wanted to remind everybody that in your GoToWebinar drop-down screen, you will notice that there is a questions tab. There's both a questions and a chat tab. We monitor the questions tab. Eric will be paying close attention to that. And at the end of the presentation, we will facilitate questions to both Victor and Mike. And then this is your way to inject, given the limits of a webinar, excuse me. So please use that, and as they come up during the presentation, it's really nice to send those in so we don't get kind of a flurry of them towards the end, if at all possible. Lastly, if you're an owner out there listening today and you happen to have gathered a group of your folks around, either a lunch table or in the conference room, something like that, we certainly are interested in knowing about that, because we obviously try to track the true total number of folks that are listening in, not just on a particular line item or person's name that we get here in our view of the attendees who have signed in. Okay. So let me move towards our featured speakers for the day. And I want to first introduce Dr. Victor Sanvido. He's the Senior Vice President at Southland Industries, and he's responsible for developing and delivering custom design, build, and integrated project delivery solutions for Southland's customers. He also facilitates and participates in select industry research initiatives centering on practical applications of lean principles, prefabrication, BIM, and design build methods to improve the project deliveries. And I think you're going to hear about those very subjects today. And I also, maybe Victor can confirm this, believe participated in the very well-known Penn State study that it's now actually several years old, but was a linchpin to launch design build into the industry's consciousness. Victor is just very active in design build, speaks at an awful lot of events, and just brings a tremendous amount to our industry. So we're really excited to have him speak today. We're equally excited to introduce Mr. Mike Korthals. He's the Vice President of the Nevell Group over pre-construction, and he is a partner. And Mike brings 15 years to the construction industry, and he oversees all of Nevell's project procurement and pre-construction efforts, and in developing, managing, and maintaining key client relationship. And he clearly understands the responsibility of being a partner that's brought in on early design phases to establish the budget and manage design in the budgets, provide constructability perspectives, and schedule input and coordinate with other key trades. So, as Eric mentioned, this particular subject is way overdue, and really excited to kind of talk about how our industry trade partners view the world, and how what advice they might have to our owners. So I think at this point I'm turning it over to Victor, and Victor, thank you for joining us. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Yeah, your question about the Penn State study, in 1998, I believe, 1996, we completed the comparison of design build, CM at risk, and design bid build, and proved that the only reason that design build was 6% lower unit cost, 33% faster, and 10% higher quality than design bid build, and CM at risk performed fairly close to design bid build, but slightly better. And based on that, we were able to get the law changed at the federal level and in several other states. That study was repeated a couple of years ago by Keith Molinar, John Messner, and their team, and they confirmed that the results were similar in the same ballpark. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about trade partners in design build, and what is a trade partner versus a subcontractor. And I think there is a significant difference in responsibility between someone who you have as a partner at the start of the project than somebody who comes on late as a pure subcontractor or a vendor. Next slide, please. The two things we'd look at that I'd like to cover today is what does the owner need to consider when selecting specialty trade partners, and then for the trade partners, what should they consider when looking at projects and trying to determine are they real design build jobs or just design bid build one level down. Next, please. So there are really 4 considerations that an owner should look at. I think number 1 is if the owner engages the general contractor and A&E as a design builder, does the GC and A&E have their whole team name going in? If they are, then are they design build partners, or are they just a bunch of vendors that have been lined up to pick different roles, much like a design bid build job one level down? So then you look at the trade partner and say, are they design builders, which means they have responsibility for design and for installation of those pieces in the field. Then you might expect that the owner's getting the true benefit of design build down at the trade partner level, because if you remember, 90% of the work is done by trade partners and 10% of the work by the general contractor. And so it's important to engage the people who are actually physically performing the work, so they can get their mind to understand the design intent, so they can provide input to that design to make sure that it's constructible, and they build the job in their head before they get to the field. And the second type of trade partner really is what I would call the design bid build, where a general contractor and A&E will draw a bunch of pictures, carry it through schematic design development, maybe even CDs, carry three trade partners along to get nominal constructability input, and then they bid them out and they pick the lowest price. I would suggest that if that is happening, the owner might as well just go to straight design bid build, because they're not getting the real input from the people doing the work. Because as a trade partner, we're going to give just enough information not to get disqualified, but you never put your best foot forward early on when there's competition around. It's just a fact of life. Next, please. So the next consideration I think the owner should look at is, who's the engineer of record? Are they an employee of the trade partner? And so when you're looking at, say, for example, mechanical design builder, you have a certain advantage if that engineer is an employee of the mechanical company, because there's nowhere to hide anymore. They all belong to the same organization. They can design with tighter tolerances. They have a direct link to the construction and commissioning folks to make sure everything works at the end. And the owner has one place to go if a system does not work. The second option people look at is the trade partner goes out and hires an engineer as their subcontractor, and they have a certain amount of control and influence over that subcontractor. And the third one, where you actually have the least control, is where that engineer is subcontracted to the architect, because their direction comes from the architect. They don't really have to listen to the input of that trade partner, and they don't have to consider it. And there may not be as much dialogue as where they are when they are employees of the same company. Now, I do recognize that not all trade partners have in-house engineering or design. And that really is a function of the size of the company and what's common in the marketplace. But I would suggest that where they're one and the same, you might be getting better value if those people have experience in the right type of facility you're building. If they don't, I would almost go to option 2. And even though that trade partner doesn't have experience in that area, they should go out and find an engineer that does have experience, so they're not learning from scratch. Next, please. Third consideration then is, when do we select? And if you look at the research data will show that 50% of a cost of a project is fixed in the programming phase and 75% in schematic. So if you want to get maximum value, you engage the trade partners in validating the project and planning it. If you can't get them then they should be engaged in the schematic design. And then after that, it's any ideas that come up after that are essentially creating rework for the rest of the team. And the rest of the team is going to be demotivated or not motivated in a positive way to take that input, because they've got to redo their documents, redo drawings, and go back and have conversations again. So failure to bring the teams on, the team members on in the programming planning phase will result in rework further down. So for the simpler buildings, you can do in schematic design, but a complex building, you need people to understand the business case on day one. The fourth consideration then is the selection process. And I think this ties up nicely with the design. There's a design build done right guideline that's probably about 20 pages long. There's a section 2 that talks about procurement, and it identifies several attributes that they suggest an owner should do in their procurement phase to create best value. I picked a few of these out. Number one is a procurement cycle of 1 to 2 weeks. We'll see the best-in-class projects from the time the RFP is released until the team is selected is a 1 to 2 week procurement cycle. Some people take as long as 3, 4, 5, 6 months. That demotivates people and is absolute waste, because most of the product created in the procurement phase gets thrown away. An A3 response is fairly common among progressive owners now, which is one 11 by 17 sheet of paper, all the relevant questions for that project. And I would suggest that it's difficult to write an A3 response because, you know, I didn't write a short response because I had the time. I didn't have enough time, and so I wrote a long one. And so the long responses really have a lot of stuff in there that doesn't help you determine whether you want these people or not. And I would encourage owners to get to, you know, 1 11 by 17 sheet of paper, maybe 2, but more than that is people don't have to think, and it creates a large amount of waste that reviewers have to pick through, and they ultimately don't read it. The third consideration is who's going to be on the project, and how do these people behave in the interview. So we've been involved in some fairly large project interviews, and we will be given 2 questions for the interview, and they look and see how you might solve that problem in the context of the rest of the team, what your thinking is like, what questions you have to ask, how you think. And so you want to look at your trade partners and see in the interview, do they behave the right way? Are they able to interact in the early design phases with the design team and the construction team in a way that creates value, or are they just a collection of people that you might want to keep until later on and then bring them in by low price? Who's the executive sponsor in the trade partners organization? Because you need somebody you can go to get things resolved when things get stuck on a project. And then lastly, experience. We find experience is important, but it's not the most important. We've seen people do one-of-a-kind projects with no experience in that. And the nice thing is when people don't have experience and they recognize it, they tend to think of novel solutions. Too much experience in the same thing results in old solutions being regurgitated. And I think, you know, some people rely too heavily on this. Some people don't rely enough on it. And so I think that really is dependent on the owner's culture and the rest of the team. So that's kind of what I get out of when I look at the design build done right. And what they talk about is, they talk about item 2A is a procurement process focused heavily on qualifications of the design builder and its team members. Using a procurement process that encourages early participation of key trade contractors. 2E, owners should consider the level of effort required by proposers to develop responsive proposals and should limit the deliverables. And so I would suggest that design build done right, there are a fair number of guidelines in there that point in this direction. So what I'd like to do now is maybe talk a little bit about what does a trade partner look at when they consider which work to look at. And so let's go to the next slide. So if we're looking at these projects, we would say, first of all, is this real design build or is it bridging? And I think the data will show you that bridging design build produces results that are in some cases worse than design bid build. And bridging in the industry is seen as something that is equivalent or worse than design bid build, and the data will show that it's really waste. So anytime we see bridging, a trade partner that is a real design builder will say, you know, that's not for me. Now, sometimes you're hungry enough that you will actually take it, but they ultimately turn up being bad jobs. The second one is, who's the engineer of record? One of the key things we need to, you know, as a trade partner, you look at and say, there are certain parts of the country where there is work preservation rules and there are old school engineers that have safety factors on the order of 20 to 40% on systems. And there are certain parts of the country where the customary default design is a design that adds cost to the system. So we really have to be very careful. Is this going to be a system that is designed using modern systems? Secondly, will it be designed for prefabrication, or is this engineer someone who designs a stick-built solution? And if they design a stick-built solution, you're going to have more safety incidents in the field. You're going to have more labor on site. The job's going to go slower. You got more higher potential for having conflicts and for things going sideways. I think the third one is, can we add real value to conceptual design? And if it's a real simple building, there may not be much value you can add. So do you really want to tie your people up on a simple warehouse design or something like that? Or do you really, you know, if this is a fairly complex building with multiple diverse mechanical loads, with a lot of odd shapes that have to be CFD modeled to understand the airflow, if it's newer technology, the trade partner can add real value. And so I would suggest the more complex the project, the earlier you want to bring the trade partner on board if they're qualified. The fourth one we look at typically is the owner occupying the facility. If it's a construct and flip kind of building, it's going to be something typically where the life cycle costing is not going to go into it, and it's going to be typically a low cost driven project. When the owner occupies the facility and they're manufacturing things inside them, or they're conducting their core business, they typically tend to look at durable systems, and they want real engineering, and they want maintenance costs that are in line, and they want an energy efficient building. So that becomes attractive to us. Is it a lean project, or is it a traditional, let's go make a CPM schedule and jump through a bunch of hoops and try to get done? If it's a lean project, there are the biggest benefit in a lean project is we optimize between the trades, and there are potentials to have discussions you wouldn't have time on a non-lean project. There are potential for people to collaborate and save money for everybody, and it makes a big difference, particularly with our young people who've been on lean projects. They don't want to go back to a traditional everybody against each other type of project. And so I would suggest, if there's not a big room, if there is not a prefabrication plan, if there's not a series of last planner systems in place, I would suggest that younger people just don't want to work on those jobs anymore. Our key partners present with us, as if you look at a hospital project, the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, the fire protection, the framing, we all depend on each other to come up with solutions that are buildable. And if you only have the MEP and not the framing company there, it's very difficult to come up with a good solution when the framer comes in later on with framing details that are different. We don't have agreement on interference walls. We haven't developed a philosophy of how we're going to construct the building together. And once we know how we're going to build a building, we'll design the systems to fit that for economical construction. Are we designing multi-trade prefabrication? And so the key thing is we need to look with our people and see, what are we doing as a collective design and construction organization to take bigger pieces off the field. And from a sheet metal perspective, you can manufacture one duct, and then you can section duct into 20-foot pieces. And then you can combine the hydronic piping, some of the plumbing, cable tray, insulation, and structural into a bigger rack. And then you can really go to modules where you make them full truck length. And so are we designing pieces where you can unload a truck in one pick, but not where you have people moving piles of material around the job? The fewer pieces we take to the job, the less labor we need on the project, the less potential for trade damage, the less potential for injuries on the project, and the higher the potential to get work done quickly, the higher the potential for a quality product that is inspected off-site and constructed at waist height in a facility. If we can keep cardboard off the project, we don't have to have dumpsters. If we can keep flame off the project and do that in the shop, we don't have to worry about fire watches. And so when you start looking at designing for construction or prevention through design, you can substantially improve the quality of the constructed environment. That becomes very, very important for us. We've seen projects where 2 or 3 trades are working in a prefab environment, and 2 or 3 trades are in the stick building environment, and then you see piles of materials all over the job site, and it disrupts everyone. With full employment today, people don't want to work on projects where they can't be productive. They'll rather go down the road to another job. So let's go to the next slide. I'll show you a couple of examples here. On the left, you can see a high purity piping rack, and you can see that rack's on wheels, and there's 2 pieces there that have been sectioned together. That'll be rolled out, picked in one piece and set in place. You can see in the top of the unistrut there are holes where the whole thread runs through, but it's already been tested, insulated, clamped, and you can take that piece out. You can see the some of the valves on the left side, they're wrapped in plastic. On the right-hand side, you can see equipment modules at the top right that are ready to set. And on the lower right, you can see this is fabricated modules that have been imported and are equipment set in full container sizes. And I think if you set out to design this way, you can really affect the job. This will not happen randomly if the engineer is not getting meaningful input from the trade partner and designing for fabrication. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So here's a couple of items. How can a design build entity hurt the owner? And I would suggest, if the owner contracts with an entity to deliver a design build project, if they pick the team in late, they bring the team on late, any ideas for improvement create rework, or worse, typically we see a job going over budget. They'll bring a mechanical in on a design build basis. They'll sit down, do the design, and then you create rework for the rest of the team. So when you come on the job, you have no friends. And we have to be disciplined in eliminating rework on the other teams. Dragging 3 companies along, some people will do this progressive design build and not commit to the teams early. And they'll drag 3 companies along through the until the documents get fairly well developed. Well, all you're getting is the minimum requirements, the minimum input from those 3 companies, so they don't get disqualified. And you will not get any of those good ideas until you commit to them going onto the project. And I'm being honest. I mean, people will tell you otherwise, but in reality, you're not going to get much out of people. And I think you create a tremendous amount of waste and fatigue in the industry doing this. Picking partners with no design or engineering skill. And so you get into a design build project and you select a trade partner. And they don't know how to behave around designers. They don't understand how architects design. They don't understand how structural systems are designed. They don't understand the impact of placing their equipment and their supports and what they mean to the structural designer. They don't understand that when a structural contractor buys steel, they buy it at a wholesale price, and the MEP are buying it at retail. So what do we have to do to get all of our stuff hung off the structural steel? How do we buy all that steel at one time and save the owner a lot of money? So I really think evaluating the ability to design things, and you can ask people questions in the interview and give them some problems. Say, sketch up for me 100% outside air system versus a 3-duct system, and go through the impact if I've got to change some of the functions in some of the rooms. What calculations need to be done, and how would you do them? I think the 4th one is picking partners who stick build, and take a couple of job walks and see what look at their photographs in their brochures, look at the photographs on their website. Those photographs tell a story about how they build. And then lastly, I think keeping the partners away from the owner. You get some folks who have a design build contract with the owner, and the prime contractors like to keep the trade partners away from the owner to say, this is my customer, when in fact it's all of our customers. And I think scripting what those conversations might look like, they're a bit nervous because sometimes some of the subcontractors might advocate something that makes no sense for the team. I think there needs to be some trust built, and you've got to get to the point so the team interacts with the owners and work with them in a meaningful way. Next, please. So what I would suggest is trade partner value. As a mechanical, what's the impact of our systems on structural? What's the impact on framing? What's the impact on concrete? What's our impact on electrical? If we don't understand that, we may do things that cost the job more money. The next one is something that's near and dear to me. I hear people say, oh, we had 10,000 clashes on a project. And I say, that's really is a problem because you just wasted a lot of time. Develop your concepts and talk about how you're going to route things before you draw anything. To me, clash detection is essential, but clash detection is waste by definition. Right size the systems we've covered before. Designing for prefabrication and modules. The more I can make off-site, the more I can alleviate the labor crunch in the job. The more I can simplify the assembly requirements, the better the chance for higher quality. If trade partners don't understand life cycle costing, they may make decisions that sub-optimize the cost for the owner and the operating cost of the building. The trade partner needs to understand what cost certainty is. How do they provide to the owner certainty that what they're drawing or what they install, certainty that the cost for what they're proposing is the cost. Reliable workflow. And I think the big thing in design builders is where you have an engineer who assigns 2 people to the job for the duration versus an engineer that has more capacity. If my motivation is to have 2 people for the whole duration. When I get urgency and variable workflow from the construction side, the engineer has an inability to react. And so I think make sure your engineering partner, same company or subcontracted, does have the ability to respond rapidly to things that need to be done on the job. And really a reflection in your engineering company, or if it's the in-house engineering and a trade partner, that their function is there to support construction. Make sure they have enough resources to react in a way to not delay any construction activities. Okay, next one. And I think this is a couple of simple examples here of what I mean. So if you look at on the left there, that is a 50-foot duct, 10-foot wide, about 6 foot deep. It's made as one piece rather than a whole bunch of small ducts. It's sectioned. Because this team was involved early on, they could have discussions with a steel erector. The steel erector is putting that on before they put their bar joists in, and you're saving it off. You're doing about 3 weeks of work in a day. On the right-hand side, this is another case of, you can see there are sprinkler pipes. The bar joists are laying on top of the slab. The bar joists are assembled in 9 by 18 meter sections. The sprinkler pipes loaded in, cable tray gets loaded in. And now this team that's been working together as a design builder, the crane can now pick that whole thing as one, and you eliminate all the work off the scissor lifts. And so that's a much safer environment, and it goes very quickly. Just 2 examples. Next slide. And I think we've talked a little bit about equipment locations. We've talked a bit about risers. If you want to have a prefab design, make sure all the risers come up the building together. Don't spread them out. On the steel side, determine what's going to be supported from the steel and what's going to be supported from the floor. Fire smoke dampers are an item. The way I design my mechanical and my smoke zones and the way I run the duct will have an impact of, can be sometimes 3 times the amount of smoke dampers you have on a project versus one that's got the smoke zones and duct directions laid out properly. And the smoke dampers don't look like much, but they show up in electrical budget, framing budget, drywall budget, a sheet metal budget. And so these are things that are maintenance items that will, and there are costs to the job that don't need to be added if you understand what they are. And then really the perimeter distribution and kicker details. When a framing contractor comes on, they all have unique kicker details. They affect the perimeter distribution of a mechanical substantially. And I think what we have to do is, if we know who that person is, we can figure out our distribution, and that's a lot of money. So anyway, I've thrown a few examples out there. I'll turn it over to Mike now.
Okay, great, Victor. That was great, and thank you. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about some of the ideas and approaches that Victor was talking about, and kind of more specifically down to the drywall and exterior envelope and design build right for the metal framing and drywall. And you know, Nevell Group looked at it 5 years ago in this design build world and really saw the metal framing drywall was not consistently brought on as a best practice as part of the design build process. And really we understood why. There was a lot of good metal framing drywall contractors that knew how to estimate. They knew how to create VE ideas. The challenge with that is, in a design build world, we view the VE process as a reactive process. So early on, when we got into these design builds and we were brought in later, I'll go to use Victor's point early, we didn't have a lot of friends in the design build world because we started showing up, and architect had to do a lot of rework, MEP had to do a lot of recoordination, and these are things that they didn't put into their time frame nor their cost in the front end side. So we really challenged ourselves about 5 years ago of what do we do to impact more design side of our trade, and how do we impact it earlier on. So I've kind of put a list of some of the things that are important. And again, I think, you know, the drywall's side of it has just been lagging where the MEP is to the level of managing design. Again, they've managed cost and been good at reacting, but not being proactive. So these are some of the things that come from a best practice standpoint on looking at when you get a drywall and exterior envelope contractor brought on at the same time as the MEPs, and again, as Victor said, very early in the process. So some of the things that we're managing today is, and we manage the BOD, we take responsible for the RFP and the performance specs. So one of the key pieces is STC wall assemblies. A lot of times there's acousticians that are brought on board. So what we'll do is take the acousticians' STC ratings and we'll manage really those wall assemblies from the beginning. So when we're establishing a budget at an early DD, call it even SD levels, we've already provided that we understand, which typically they're in a BOD, the STCs, we can establish that budget with the wall assemblies that we're going to be building to. So again, we use and talk about, designing once. And typically what we see is these, with our sound ratings being able to use, it's gauge, stud gauge, spacing, materials, new materials that are in the marketplace, we're typically able to give thinner walls, which are able to give, the architect and the owner more space in their rooms. The other key piece that we're managing early on, and again, designing elements into, is the exterior on the Title 24. This is a huge piece for us, especially in California. So another piece on the exterior is the assemblies for the NFP 285, and these are exterior flame spread, coordinating with the exterior structure, so being able to work parallel with the structure on how we're going to connect to the structure versus letting those get designed and then having to back up. Interior fire ratings with correct UL listings. Again, this is an issue, challenge that comes up a lot of times when we're not involved at the design phase of being able to get those identified correctly and be able to get them priced. And again, this is an important piece, that when you price it at a schematic level, you want to ensure that you've got the correct ratings of what's going to be built. Managing the overall design to a budget and designing once. So all these 5 bullets above are things that we manage, but there's so much more that goes into, backing is another one. Soffits on early design build. Those are typically things that are not shown on an SD and at a proposal phase of design build. And so if those get developed without us being involved, typically they're not developed correctly, and a lot of times there's the cost is not carried appropriate for those. So we really work hard on looking at the overall budget early on, and then once we get into design, an important piece for us is we talk a lot about cost neutral. So, for an example, when a ceiling all of a sudden becomes rated that wasn't rated, we look for other ways within our scope of how do we keep that and offset it with a cost neutral. BIM coordination, working parallel with MEP. I mentioned early on in our design build journey, we didn't have a lot of friends because they thought we were a pain in the butt because they would have to rework because some of our key areas we couldn't move, and so they were re-coordinating around. So that's key, is getting off and coordinating parallel with them. Eliminating material escalation. This is key, and I know that, and again, this is something MEPs have managed for some time, but when we're brought on at an SD level, we're committing to that price and removing any escalation of any material. And then another key piece is, Victor talked about, is identifying prefab opportunities for us. So some of the key pieces that we're identifying today are exterior finished prefab panels. So meaning the panels are coming out completely finished, we're flying them, and we're attaching them to the structure. And what's key here is being involved early on to be able to understand what the owner and the design team wants from a finished look on the exterior, because with our finished panels, it's almost endless of the types of materials that we can put on there. The other key piece is on just the exterior panels is being able to analyze them versus a precast panel, curtain wall, and being able to take advantage of the weight of our panels, because typically our panels are anywhere from 8 to 12 pounds per square foot. So being able to allow to take advantage of that in the structure. And if we don't have that opportunity, once the drawings are more in a late DD, CD stage, we miss those opportunities. So that's kind of specifically talking about our the drywall and exterior envelope, and kind of, I guess what I would leave it is just we don't see the consistency and the best practice of always thinking about bringing the drywaller into the process early on. So that's it. Questions?
Okay, well, that's what a great hands-on presentation about how these things come together. I mean, the MEP side of our business has been doing design build long before the general contractors were doing design build. So it's nice to see that the other specialty trades are coming along. For instance, the work that Nevell is doing and others. So as we look at the prefab work in particular, which seems to be one of the latest evolutions of how we're putting these jobs together, do you have any information on how that affects, from an owner's perspective, the costs on a job are so varied, but safety on the job is one of those things that the owner has no control over to speak of. And so what are you seeing as the safety benefits of doing this prefab?
So Mike, we pulled 5 million man hours as a sample, and we found that when we designed for prefab and prefabricated, we had a total recordable incident rate of 0.19. And where there was a third-party design and a stick-built solution, our performance was about a 1.9. So we see a 10-fold reduction in incidents in recordables. And I think ethically you have to ask yourself now, why would I expose my people to an unsafe environment where it's a third-party design? And that's a difficult question for us to wrestle with as a company.
Mike, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Well, yeah, I guess the only thing I would say, just from a safety for us, and we don't, just because we're early in the process of the exterior finished panels, but for an example, there was a project we just looked at, and if we were to build that in place with scaffold, we were going to have a crew size of about 45 for just the exterior, and with our panel crew flying finished panels, it would be a crew size of 6. So drastically just less manpower on site.
Amazing. Mike Meredith, do you have any questions?
Not at this time, Eric.
Okay. Are you getting any union pushback on the prefab work?
From Nevell, we've not. We've actually had them embrace it.
Yeah, we have not had any pushback. In fact, it's enabled us to go to some new areas of the country and work with the local trades and create some opportunities for that local union to embrace prefab. The current example is in Philadelphia, where we've got 13 trade partners with us in a major hospital, and they're manufacturing product in a local fab shop with all the trades present. There are ways you have to organize the shops so you have people in areas, but you can have the workflow between them.
So, Victor, this is Mike Meredith. So do you expect, though, that the big part of the reason you don't have an issue there is because those offsite locations are actually unionized?
Yes, we are In areas where there is a significant union presence, we would fabricate in those areas. Yes.
Got it. Okay.
So there's a question that came in from listeners. Do you see a trend among general contractors to go design build into the trades, or is this a trend? Is the trend still low bid?
For us, I would say probably 85% of our work is design build today.
Yeah, we're, I would say that we're design build and integrated form of agreement, multi-party contracts where we're the engineer of record. It's probably that similar number, 80, 85%. In markets like this today, you can choose. If the market was different and everybody went the other way, I'm sure we would end up doing more of that.
So with everybody using BIM now, whether you're the metal framing and drywall guy, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing guy, the architect, the engineers, how are the BIM protocols working out, and who's in first, who's taking the lead, who owns the deal?
We use the Penn State BIM Guide, which was developed with the funded by the Pankar Research Foundation, and it's pretty much become one of the standards in the industry that lays out a framework for how you would make that decision. But essentially, the team gets together on day one and says, who needs what and for what purpose. So the question becomes, how do we preserve design intent? And how do we draw only the objects we're going to use? And if you take a managed approach like that, specifications are really fall into the waste category, because you can select what you're going to use, and the generic objects that are not able to be used in manufacturing become irrelevant, and you have to use the objects that you're actually going to install in the job. And then you end up drawing all the fittings in the ductwork rather than just a tube. It's got the flanges on, it's got the seismic supports and everything. So you actually get a model that you can actually build. And clashes in a model that you can't build means nothing. You've got to make sure that your actual model you can install is clash-free when you include insulation, pipe supports, seismic bracing, all the offsets, everything.
One of the longest outlived myths of doing design build is that the owners lose control of the design. I'm weary of that myth. Do you have any comments on it?
Well, the owners don't have any control of the design once they hand it over to somebody else, but they rarely hand it over to someone else. If the owner is engaged all the way through with the team, then they have as much control as they want. The myth in the owner community is that because they're sitting in meetings, they believe they have control. However, if they don't make decisions when they're supposed to make, and if they don't understand the drawings they're looking at, then they really don't have control. And control is something that's shared between everybody. I think if you got a team that works collaboratively in a big room, where you understand each other's intent and you've taken time to build trust and you understand the owner's business case, the whole team is actually looking out for that business case rather than just one person.
And I think they should take a look at progressive collaborative design build approach, which brings more of the collaborative spirit, keeps the risk at the owner level. When you bring a team on board, the risks move later in the process versus when the team's awarded.
Eric, can I jump in and ask a question? And look, we're right at the limit here, so this might end up being the last question, but that lead into progressive, I'm sort of curious from both of your gentlemen's perspective, when, assuming you've made a decision or an owner's made a decision to go with progressive, what's your recommendation or thoughts about when and how to bring the sub trade partners into the process. And do you have thoughts or comments on a strategy that would still allow for a GC to bid out the sub trades or the major trades?
Well, I think bidding out is one approach, but I think what is probably the most sensible is to engage the team early, create the target value, and as long as the project stays at the target value, the team stays together. If the team deviates from this target value, then you dismiss the whole team, general contractor, A&E, designer, subs, everybody, because the team hasn't delivered on the promise. I believe as soon as you take a team member and isolate them in a box, you don't have a team anymore. And the person who does this the best I think is Jeff Neumeier at San Francisco International. There might be other people who are doing it well. His process is best I've seen in the United States. He absolutely gets it. He treats people as a partner. And he's got a great deal of trust. He spends time building the team. He gets the best out of his people. And it's really through his behavior and his level of trust and the way he treats these people.
I would agree with that. That's excellent. So, Eric, do you have any other final questions before we close out?
I don't have any other questions, but I want to really thank Victor and Mike for a really great presentation. I want to also add that for those of you that are going to attend the national conference in Las Vegas coming up in November, the first day they're going to have a progressive design build presentation in the morning of Wednesday. I forget the actual date, but it's in November, the first Wednesday in November. So with that plug, we appreciate everybody being online, and send us your suggestions for future topics. And then Mike, anything from you?
Just to close with another round of gratitude to Mike and Victor. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you would consider coming back and talk to us. There's a lot more here to share with our owners. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll close it out at this time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.